and today Brother Franklin Camp. We will introduce Brother Camp further tonight because he is one of the speakers on that particular occasion, but just suffice it to say now that Brother Camp lives in Birmingham, Alabama, and stays extremely busy preaching, teaching, and writing, and is truly one of the finest and deepest students among us today in the churches of the Lord, and anybody who has been to our lecture programs before or read his writings and sat at his feet will certainly concur with that observation. And so he will explain to us the details of how he desires to conduct the forum. And before he so does, let me just simply preface it by saying this. This is an open forum. It is a study session. We're not here to settle issues. We're not here to deal in personalities. We're here to study. And there will be some conflicting expressions given in the open forum, but don't get disturbed. We're here to study. You don't get disturbed when it's a private discussion. And so that's what this is, except somewhat amplified. And so remember that it's just a study session, and that being true, we approach it from that standpoint, and it'll be very profitable, I know. Brother Camp.
You noticed on the schedule that I was to be on the open forum tomorrow. I had my plane scheduled to leave at 3:51 tomorrow. I had everything taken care of, and Brother Winkler called up and said, "How about switching?" And I think he meant to switch me instead of otherwise. For a long time I conducted the open forum at Alabama Christian College and for several years at Lipscomb. The older I became and the more I studied the Bible, the more I realized the lack of ability that I really had to conduct an open forum. I would say that there are two things that I'm really lacking in qualifications for, and I'd put them in this order. Number one, a song leader. Number two, to conduct an open forum. I'd like to underscore the word. He said I was to moderate. And the word moderate, among other things, means moderation. So I hope as we discuss matters that you can remember, let your moderation be made known unto all men. There are some things that I think we need to keep in mind. I'm sure that the most of the questions that will be discussed are questions about which brethren have differed. One of the things that's characterized the Restoration movement has been areas of difference where brethren could have their convictions about certain things and differ over them, and yet at the same time still maintain their fellowship and their friendship one with another. I do not care which side you may take on any question. The only thing that I want to emphasize is that let us all do it in the right spirit. There are questions that we can differ over and not be lost. But there are attitudes that can develop in our differences that will cause all of us to be lost. And that's the thing that we need to keep in mind. I think that we ought to be able to discuss anything with a spirit of appreciation of others, not question the integrity of anyone, and to give people the right to have their own convictions. I'll talk some tonight about the importance of the individual nature of Christianity in relation to liberty. And one of the characteristics of Christianity is that it's intensely an individual matter. This being true, we must allow people the opportunity to develop their own convictions and their own study. I wouldn't believe anything that anybody taught until I had first studied it and decided in my own mind that that's what I believe the Bible teaches. I'd be afraid to do otherwise. And since that's the way I do, then I wouldn't ask anybody else to do otherwise. So I hope that we can have a discussion. I've got enough questions to last the rest of this month. And I'll just turn over the rest of them, and Brother McCord's going to be on Thursday, and y'all can stay the rest of the week. Brother McCord will take care of all that I can't handle. And if you are not pleased with the answer that I give or you get from the audience, then Brother McCord will settle all of them on the last day. If an elder's wife passes away, should the elder remain in the eldership or step down? Does he cease to meet the qualifications husband of one wife? Now let me state, most of the questions that I'll read, I'll make some brief comment on them. At least that's what I hope to do, and then let you comment as any way that you like. There's some things in connection with this question that I think need to be considered along with it. I would see no reason why the man who was an elder and his wife died would not continue to be the husband of one wife and to be able to function as an elder. And yet I think that we cannot always answer questions like this simply from a technical standpoint. I think an elder involves a matter of leadership. And if you had a congregation where 90% of the people felt that it is impossible for a man to scripturally serve as an elder whose wife is dead, I do not believe that he could function as an elder effectively, even though I think he'd qualify as far as Scripture is concerned. And it's my judgment that sometimes when you come to things such as this, it's questions that need to be decided upon the basis of the good of the congregation. I found that many times when you get into discussions of issues like this, the church gets into a squabble, and whatever the outcome is, it's destroyed the effectiveness of the church any way you go. And so that would be my suggestion. I might say that I had a brother, that was an elder. His wife died, and he resigned as an elder because he felt that he could not, in keeping with this passage, still function as an elder. He's my oldest brother, and he's bigger than I am, but he got the brawn and I got the mind, so he's wrong and I'm right. But at any rate, that'd be my comment on it. Now, any comments that you want to make? Raise your hand so I'll know if you want to comment. Don't be afraid, because you're out there where you're safe. Okay.
Brother Camp, you said you didn't see any problem with a man still serving as if he had only one wife. Suppose he remarried, would he cease to have one wife?
That'd be my judgment.
He could never be reinstated as elder then if he remarried?
I couldn't understand the question.
He could not be restated as an elder if he remarried?
Yes, I think he could be. It's my judgment that he'd be the elder, the husband of one wife. If his first wife's dead, I think it's my judgment that it has reference to marriage and divorce and remarriage rather than whether or not a man's wife is dead and remarried. That's just my judgment about it. But again, I say, I think that this is a question that rather than giving a rule that would apply everywhere ought to be determined upon what would be the reaction in the congregation, how it would be accepted. I think elders need to think about how they can function effectively as leaders. And if the church is not going to follow a man in an area like this, where you have a matter of false doctrine taking over and destroying the church, leading into possibly a different thing. But where you have a man that's otherwise acceptable, I see no reason for him not to continue on. Did somebody? Okay, brother.
Brother Camp, the answer which you've given is, at least in my judgment, absolutely excellent, scriptural. But I wanted to emphasize a thought because the question does so often arise. There are three types of qualifications listed, at least from this particular viewpoint. There'd be three. You have qualifications which are absolute, that a man either is married or is not. That's an absolute situation. There are qualifications which are relative. An elder is to be apt to teach. That doesn't mean he's got to be the best teacher in town or in the county or in the congregation. And then there are qualifications which are perpetual. That is, these qualifications which once a man has attained, he will not lose them under ordinary circumstances. He will not lose them unless he loses his mind, which is certainly possible serving in the eldership. But these are perpetual. Say, here's a man 50 years of age. He has, let's say, he has 2 grown sons. They're still at home. They're faithful Christians. This man is being considered for the eldership. He is properly selected and appointed, and he is serving as an elder of the church. And 3 days later, these 2 sons are killed in a tragic automobile accident. Now then, is he disqualified, or does he still have the same qualifications that he had? There are qualifications which are absolute, which are relative, which are perpetual.
I think that's the second comment concerning the sons is parallel to the other. Any other question or comment? Am I dogmatic if I stand for the truth, even though it means going against someone who is much older than I, who happens to be a gospel preacher? Am I wrong for debating propositions that I know to be wrong according to the Scripture? Well, in the first place, discussing things with older people would not necessarily be dogmatic. To stand for the truth is not necessarily to be dogmatic in the sense in which it may be used. A person ought to have firm convictions and stand for what's truth or what their convictions are, regardless of what situation may be. We need to approach a thing in the right way when we're discussing things with other people. There's the truth of the gospel is set forth, and I don't know how to discuss some truths in the Bible without somebody saying you're dogmatic about that. Because if that's what the Bible says, I know no other way to face it and to stand for it. I'm dogmatic from the standpoint that baptism is a condition of salvation. But I think that sometimes our being dogmatic may involve an attitude by which we approach the discussion of matters. And so, if you mean, shall you stand for the truth, and even though there are people that are older, surely you must. You need to be sure that what you're standing for is truth, and be sure that you're right. And don't be afraid to debate a proposition that is scriptural, provided the situation is right. I do not believe, at least I have made it a practice, never to debate just everybody that challenged me for debate. There are times when I think debates are profitable, but there are times when I think that it'd be totally unprofitable. So I'd have to decide that question from my personal standpoint on the basis of the time and the occasion and other things involved. As an example, a Pentecostal preacher came through Birmingham, and he tried to jump on the preacher out at Leeds and challenged him for a debate. The preacher at Leeds called another preacher there in Birmingham and asked him about the matter of debating him. And he called me and wanted to know what my thinking was, and I wanted to know about it. Question number one, does he have a group of people that are backing him? Is he a loner? Does he want you to furnish the building and furnish the audience and everything? If so, I wouldn't debate him. I don't believe that under ordinary circumstances we ought to furnish an audience to a man that just wants to go around and debate. That's my thinking about it, and I wouldn't debate under circumstances like that. I think a man ought to be a reputable man. He ought to have somebody backing him, and it ought to be under circumstances that are acceptable to both people. I haven't done that much debating. Brother Deaver's done a whole lot more than I have, and he might want to comment a little bit on that. You want to make a comment about that, Brother Deaver? About the matter of debating? Okay. Anybody else want to make a statement on this? Raise a question. I think we ought to be able to discuss things with anybody regardless of our age. And I think when we go about it in the proper way and attitude, we can generally do it. I think there's a general rule that you can preach anything you need to preach if you do it at the right time and the right spirit and the right way. I think you can talk with people about any subject if you do it at the right time and the right way and the right spirit. And that would be my comment on that. The second question, is Satan a created being or is he eternal? I think I can answer the second part, that he's not eternal. The next part, I don't know how much I know about it. I think if you accepted the fact that he is eternal, then he'd have to be equal with God. I don't believe that. But the more I've studied the Bible and the older I've become, the less certain I am how much I know or what the Bible teaches about the origin of evil. So I'm a little hesitant about saying much about that. Now, we have some, I'm sure, that feel otherwise, and you may feel free to say whatever you like about it. Anybody want to comment? Mighty quiet audience today. Third question. This statement was made concerning me. It's a shame that these young preachers can't have 25 years of experience under their belt before they go out and teach and preach others. How do you feel about this statement? I think that's a good question. I think it's one, especially in view of the fact that there's some students here. And I believe it's a question that deserves some consideration. I know that the student that turned that question in had a concern about it. I think it's true that there are some things that you have to learn from experience. But I don't think it follows that just because you haven't had experience for 50 years that you're unable to preach. There are some things that can help a young man a great deal as a young preacher. And I'd like to offer some suggestions that I believe will be worthy of consideration to young men that are preaching. I think Timothy was unusually fortunate in that he had the Apostle Paul to associate with. What a blessing. What an opportunity to have the guidance and the instruction and the wisdom and the help and the concern and the care of a man like the Apostle Paul to bring questions to bring problems to. Here's something that every young preacher ought to try to develop. An association with an older man who's balanced, who's had experience, who has a knowledge of the Bible, who's willing to give you some of his time and sit down and talk with you about problems of every sort and kind. One of the two great blessings in my life, number one, my father was a pioneer preacher. He only had about a 5th grade education, technically, but he knew the Bible. He was a man of unusual wisdom. As I began preaching, his wisdom and good judgment saved me, no doubt, many a heartache and kept me from creating problems within the church. It was a blessing in my life to have him to go to and say, now here's a problem. I need your advice. What would you suggest? Help me. What should I do about it? And the wisdom that I received has been a blessing and a help, and I've cherished it all my life. He died, and I was blessed in living in the state of Alabama where Brother Gus Nichols lived and preached. The first year I preached the gospel, Brother Nichols came to Montford and held a meeting and stayed in our home. And I had the opportunity of knowing him. And the instruction and the wisdom and the help that I received from Brother Nichols, no doubt, saved me many a heartache and perhaps saved the church heartache. Because when problems came up, I'd go to Brother Nichols and say, here's the problem. You've had experience. You know how to deal with it. What would you suggest? And in some instances, I would ask Brother Nichols to come and to help in given situations where problems arose. So here's I think in relationship to this question, is something that young men should remember. Find somebody that you respect and somebody that loves you and somebody that's interested in young preachers, and then let them help you. You'll run into experiences in life that you've never faced. You'll run into problems you don't know how to handle. They'll be above and beyond you, lacking experience and knowledge and many other things. And if you just rush into them on your own, it's likely that you'll blunder and make a mistake. But if you can find an older man to develop close ties with and that you can depend on, that'll love and help you, then that's what I suggest you do. All right, any questions? What about gifts to encourage contributions to efforts to preach the gospel? I think we ought to encourage people to give all they can to preach the gospel everywhere. We'll never overgive, and I'm disturbed over the fact that the church of the first century, as far as I've been able to determine, is the only one that's ever carried the gospel of their own generation. We don't think enough about it. I think one of the tragedies in the church today is that there are men that want to go to fields and carry the gospel, and they have to beg. That's a sad commentary on our Christianity. We need to think seriously about it. This world is dying without the gospel. The world is in turmoil. The hope of the world depends upon the church of the Lord. We cannot live in the lap of luxury, enjoy all the things that we enjoy while men die without God and without hope, never hear one single gospel sermon, and expect to meet God in the judgment and hear Him say, well done. Therefore, I would say that one of the real weaknesses in the church, I think, is in the area of our attitude toward material things and our attitude toward giving. That's another. I remember, and I hesitate to use Brother Nichols so much with some of the family here, but they knew I loved and appreciated him. But people that were appealing for money always came through Jasper. And every appeal they made, when I was there, and I've been there a number of times in meetings and otherwise, and Brother Nichols would always make a personal contribution. And there's some interesting things along this line. Perhaps this will be a good time to mention it. I lived at Shades Mountain, and I appreciate the church at Adamsville. Any man that's a missionary, or whatever may be his work, that wants to come and talk to the elders and make an appeal, they'll hear his plea. Now, they don't help everybody that comes, but they don't turn anybody down. That's one of their rules that they live by. If you're an honorable man in relationship to the gospel of Christ, you can come and we'll talk to you about it. And they're helping all around the world. And I appreciate that. But at Shades Mountain, there were 3 widows while I was there. Whenever anybody came through and made an appeal, if they should ask me, can you name some people in the church that you're sure will give me a contribution on the appeal that I'm making, I would have named those 3 widows at the top of the list. Now that ought to tell us something. Isn't it strange that in Mark 12 that it was a widow that Jesus commended? What have they learned about life that makes them know that they can depend on God and serve and sacrifice and love and give and help? Perhaps in their loneliness and in their struggle of life alone, they've come to know you can trust God, sacrifice for Him, and He'll take care of you. That's something we need to learn. And so I think we need to give a great deal of consideration to encouraging all kinds of gifts. Give people an opportunity to give. I don't think it hurts. I know there are those who say that it'll affect our budget. I don't think it'll affect your budget. In reality, it'll help it. I've never heard a missionary come by and speak, but what it made me resolve, I wanted to give more and do more. Maybe I've said too much about that because that's not a pleasant subject. Anybody want to comment on that? The next question is, does God chastise us, Hebrews 12:5, in advance or through the correction, rebuking given in His Word, or both? I think that at least the best comment on that I know is found in the 8th chapter of the book of Deuteronomy. Let me just read these verses, and this will be my comment on that. All the commandments which I command thee this day shall ye observe to do, that ye may live and multiply and go in and possess the land which the Lord sware unto your fathers. Thou shalt remember all the way which the Lord thy God led thee these 40 years in the wilderness, now mark it, to humble thee and to prove thee and to know what was in thine heart, whether thou wouldest keep His commandments or not, or no. And He humbled thee and suffered thee to hunger and fed thee with manna which thou knewest not, neither did thy fathers know, that He might make thee to know that man doth not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God. Thy raiment waxed not old upon thee, neither did thy foot swell these 40 years. Thou shalt also consider in thine heart that as a man chasteneth his son, so the Lord thy God chasteneth thee. And in the verses following, he warns against the danger of getting over into the land, and then because they became full or were prosperous, that they forgot God. And so I think that, among other things, what is called the chastening of the Lord has to do with the discipline of life as the trials and the hardships come our way. And out of this, God helps us to know our own selves and helps us to see whether or not we really love God because of who He is and what we appreciate Him for, or we just want to follow God during the good times. So I think that's a part, at least, of what's involved in the discipline. I think it includes the different trials of life that we may be confronted with. It's to humble us so that we can know ourselves. It's not easy for us to really know ourselves in the midst of prosperity. It's when you face the trials of life and the way looks dark. Then will you hold on to God? Or as Job said, though He slay me, yet will I trust Him. Any other comment? I thought there'd be lots of talking going on here. Will God inflict greater punishment upon those who obey Him than turn their back upon Him? Or will the greater punishment be upon the individual because of his own memory of what he could have had? That's another question that I'm not sure I know a great deal about. There's a passage or two that would imply that there may be different degrees of punishment and rewards in the world beyond. But beyond that, I'm not sure that I know much, and I'm not really sure of how much that light that throws upon it. At least it suggests the idea He that knew and failed to do was beaten with many stripes, and he that did not know and did not do was beaten with few stripes. Accountability and responsibility likely will have something to do with the matter of our facing judgment. When I was in David Lipscomb College, Brother R.C. Bell was the teacher, and he illustrated it this way one time. He said that he thought of the apostle, take a gallon jug and a pint. And he said, you can fill a gallon jug and it's full, but it holds lots more than a pint. You fill a pint and it's full. And he said, when I get to heaven, I'll be a pint and I'll be full, but Paul will be a gallon and he'll be full. He said, I'll have all I can enjoy, and though it'll be a pint. And I cannot match what Paul's enjoyment will be. That may be correct. All right? Any other? Somebody comment? Okay. Right here at the front.
I wrote that question. It seems to me that when a person, in the judgment day, when a person is sent to hell, that if he has turned his back on God, that the greater punishment would come from his memory that he was serving God and he turned his back on him. He could have had heaven. This is just an opinion of mine, that the punishment will be the same except on the individual.
I'm sure that a man's memory will have a great deal to do with the punishment that he'll endure. I think the Bible teaches that. I'd agree with that. I have no problem with it.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else want to? Second question, does the verse in 1 Corinthians 14:34, let the women keep silent in the churches, for it's not permitted unto them to speak, apply to the church today? I realize there are those who say that this has reference to an assembly where there were miraculous endowments, and that it does not necessarily apply today. That's not my thinking about it. I think that even though there was an assembly where there were miraculous endowments, that the principle there is one that's based upon the relationship of man and woman. And that the woman is to be under subjection, as also saith the law. And I think it's parallel with 1 Timothy 2. And I make this statement sometimes, and it's about the best way that I know to answer it. And I know there are a number of problems in this area, and there'll probably be a number of questions that have come up in comments in relationship to it. I think the Bible teaches that a woman can do anything that a man can do, as long as in doing it, it does not place her in authority over man. I think that's the one limitation. Therefore, there were no women apostles. The nature of their work placed them in a position where they'd be in a place of authority. There were no women elders. That's the same reason. And so I think what determines it is based upon the relationship of man and woman. All right, your comment. Over, Brother Deaver.
Well, Cap, I spent an hour or so on this in the lectureship last year. I'm sorry this person wasn't here. Or obviously they would have that clearly in mind if they had been here.
Maybe it's in the book.
It's in the book. Was that last year, wasn't it? It's in the book. Last year's book. But I did stress that, and of course have through the years, that your context is a meeting in which there is the exercise of and benefits from the miraculous gifts and certain restrictions given with regard to the tongue speakers, those who would interpret tongues, the prophets' wives. But at the same time, that's not saying that there's nothing in these verses for us. I went ahead to stress, and I have the same notes here I had last year, that is in the side 1, 2, 3, 4, along this line, the principles are just as applicable as they ever were. Sometimes we become so involved in the circumstances by which a principle is taught that we fail to see the principle that's being emphasized. For example, verse 33 says that God is not a God of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints. That's just as binding now as it ever was. Let the women of you keep silence in the churches. Let them be in subjection. The principle of subjection just as binding as it ever was. Let all things be done unto edifying. Verse 26, just as binding as it ever was. Verse 40, let all things be done decently and in order. And so regardless of whether or not the circumstances out of which the messages came were unique or otherwise, the principles remain the same, and we need to emphasize these principles. It's certainly not the case that the woman is forbidden to break the silence. Now, in this meeting, she was forbidden to break the silence. It's not a regular worship meeting. If we had time, we could discuss that. We don't have that kind of time. But as Brother Camp has already pointed out, the basic restriction placed upon the woman from Genesis to the Revelation is she is not at any time, in any place, in any way, under any circumstance, to be put in position in which there would even be the risk of the possibility of her having dominion over a man. That's the thing that's forbidden.
Okay.
Brother Deaver and Brother Camp. In this verse, I know that we could use a principle, which would bring us to the next question. Are we authorized to take a verse out of context and make application to that verse where there is no application made? Would we be authorized to make an application in that verse when it doesn't apply to us today? Because I have done a little bit of studying on this, and that word speak is the Greek word leo, which means utter a sound. They're not to utter a sound, but can we take that, make application to that where there is no application made?
If I may make just a brief comment, I think she's not to speak under the circumstances in that assembly there. And as Brother Deaver said, I think there's a principle in it. And the reason she was not because of miraculous endowments. That wasn't the reason she was not to speak. But the relationship between men and women. And it was a relationship between men and women which is introduced back in chapter 11 that determines what she could do in that assembly. The speaking there was speaking such as I'm doing here, or teach a class of men. I think that's the sense in which the word speak is used there. Would you say that, Brother Deaver? That has reference to like preaching or so on. That's the kind of speaking that's under consideration. Yes.
It's any kind of
But I understand, but the sound that's being made there was through those who were speaking before an audience of mixed people. Would that not be correct in view of the context? It's where the church is assembled as men and women in that assembly, even though miraculous endowments control it. Yet at the same time, for example, a man prophesied in that assembly there. That would be the kind of speaking that's under consideration, would it not? That's what it seems to be. Okay.
A speaking which would inherently involve this dominion over man. That's always forbidden. However, in this particular circumstance, even breaking the silence would do that. Here is, let your women, I take it that that's, the women of you, and I assume that's the prophet's wives. There is no word for wife, but it's the women of you. So I have no problem with whether or not it is the prophet's wife. Well, here's the prophet up speaking, and that simply means God is speaking through him. His wife is sitting out here on the front row, and because she is his wife, and because this is a prophecy, her husband is speaking. God gives revelation through this man. She's never heard that. And she wants more information about it. She desires to speak, to ask about that. Even the instruction in that situation was, don't interrupt him. Even another prophet, if God gave a revelation to another prophet sitting by, that first prophet had to keep silence. So you have situations, at least two in this meeting, in which a man was commanded to keep silence in the church. And here she's not allowed to interrupt that prophet, even though she is his husband. I'm her husband. She has a special relationship. Don't break the silence. Don't interrupt that meeting. If you want to learn something about what is being said, wait and talk to him at home. I would emphasize those verses never did apply to a single girl, never did apply to a widow, never did apply to a Christian woman who knew more about the Bible than her husband did, but to prophets' wives in a day when there was a prophet. But the principle of the subjection, the respect, all of these things just as binding as they ever were.
To answer his question from another standpoint, for example, 1 Corinthians 12 deals with the matter of miraculous endowments too. But shall we conclude that the principle in reference to the body and each member of the body has no application today? I think it certainly does. So what you'd have to answer his question, from my standpoint, you'd have to determine whether or not there's a principle that's involved as to whether it'd have any application today. If it had no principle, then otherwise. Brother Neil, I believe you had your hand up.
Is there any application of this today outside the assembly, which is the context in 1 Corinthians 14, or outside the home, where a man and woman are husband and wife? Is there any application to this having dominion over or taking authority from?
Give a particular illustration.
Politics, business.
I can give you my judgment of it, and that's all I know. It seems to me that it's one that has general application. I realize there are problems in reference to it, and there are others that think that it's limited to the assembly in relationship to the husband and wife. But I'm not that sure about it. Not many feel that way. Brother Rubens Shelley, I think, feels about the strongest of anybody I know in relationship to it. And I wouldn't hear something that I wouldn't push on somebody. I'd just offer my suggestion or what I believed about it. I think you're getting into an area now where I suspect that there are some decisions people have to make on their own, at least from my standpoint. You want to come in again? You ought not to raise questions now. Okay, Roy.
I intended to answer that in what I said a while ago, Brother Camp, but I permit not a woman to teach nor. I would emphasize, underline this word nor. It's a very important construction here. It's called an explicative construction. It's the original term ude, and it literally, it suggests negation, but it also suggests explanatory proof of, or at least explanation with regard to. What the text actually says is, I permit not a woman to teach nor in any other way to have dominion over a man. Now, at no time, I repeat that, at no time, in no place, and under no circumstances is the woman allowed by the authority of God to be put in position or to put herself in position in which there would be even the risk of her having dominion over a man. There's no scripture, there's no authorization for a woman to be president of the United States, not that I can find in this book.
I haven't found it either. Okay, over. Brother Whitey?
True, it's not true. God authorized Deborah to have authority over men. We don't have the volume. Now, can you hear it? I say it's either true or not true, but God did authorize Deborah to have authority over men in some circumstance. So God doesn't contradict himself. I would think that you're dealing with something that would be in context, dealing with home and church. You have a businesswoman who obeys the gospel, no evidence that she was sinning in being a businesswoman. Lydia, I'm thinking about. She could have had a position of authority easily enough. I think it carries it so far that we get into a situation that we cannot live with all the consequences.
Well, I have to live with my part of it, and I let other people live with theirs.
Well, I think we have a consequence if we think through that these young women, some young women, were given the right to prophesy, which was by miraculous endowment. That promise was given in Joel, repeated in the book of Acts. And yet we have no indication from the Scriptures that these women ever spoke up in a public assembly. Now, certainly they exercised that gift, for God would not have given those young ladies the right to use the gift of prophecy had not He intended for them to use it. But when it came to the worship of the church as it was assembled for that purpose, no, they did not speak up. They exercised that gift in a personal, private way. Any woman can teach a man privately. We know that.